I declare open the meeting of the Committee on the Exercise of Human Rights of the Palestinian People. This is a special meeting to observe the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people in accordance with the provisions of GA Resolution 32/40B of December 2nd, 1977. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Kholisa Mabongo, speaking on behalf of the President of the Security Council, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, speaking Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Mr. Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, and representative of the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas at this meeting, and Mrs. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. I wish also to welcome representatives of member states, intergovernmental organizations, and representatives of civil society organizations, and all those who have accepted the committee's invitation to participate in this special meeting. Our special thanks go to Reverend Erica Williams, social justice activist with Blacks for Palestine, who has kindly accepted the committee's invitation to deliver a message as civil society representative. Allow me to remind you that this meeting is being webcast live on UN Web TV with simultaneous interpretations in all 6 UN official languages. This year, due to technical reasons, interpretation services will only be available until 12 noon, New York time. I would like to urge all the speakers to keep their statements within 5 minutes. Allow me to inform you that some of the dignitaries might have to leave the meeting and disconnect at the end of the first segment of the meeting. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me at this point to make a statement in my capacity as the chair of the committee. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, tout d'abord, permettez-moi d'exprimer au peuple palestinien les plus sincères condoléances du comité suite au décès de Saïeb Erekat, secrétaire général de l'Organisation de libération de la Palestine et négociateur en chef du processus de paix au Moyen-Orient, qui a consacré toute sa vie à la paix et à la réalisation des droits inaliénables de son peuple, notamment le droit à l'autodétermination et à l'indépendance. Cet objectif est celui que partage déjà depuis longtemps notre comité, créé il y a 45 ans, le 10 novembre 1975. Cette année, 1975, alors que nous nous réunissons pour célébrer la journée, cette année-ci, alors que nous nous réunissons pour célébrer la journée internationale de solidarité avec le peuple palestinien, nous traversons une période inédite. La pandémie de Covid-19 fait rage dans le monde entier, causant des pertes humaines et des perturbations économiques sans précédent. Aujourd'hui, la situation est particulièrement grave dans les territoires palestiniens occupés, y compris à Jérusalem-Est, où les cas d'infection se multiplient et où la détresse sociale et les difficultés économiques s'aggravent, touchant en particulier les femmes et les enfants palestiniens, et où le peuple palestinien supporte déjà les conséquences de plus d'un demi-siècle d'occupation étrangère. Marquant également le 75e anniversaire de la signature de la Charte des Nations Unies, cette année nous rappelle que l'histoire de notre organisation est intrinsèquement liée à la recherche d'une solution juste à la question palestinienne. Et pourtant, aujourd'hui, il n'y a guère de raison de célébrer. L'occupation israélienne illégale du territoire palestinien, qui dure depuis 53 ans et qui persiste encore, est maintenant aggravée par des menaces d'annexion de jure, tandis que le peuple palestinien continue d'être privé de ses droits inaliénables, notamment le droit à l'autodétermination. La vision inscrite dans la résolution 181 romain II de l'Assemblée générale, adopté il y a 73 ans, le 29 novembre 1947, à savoir la partition de la Palestine sous mandat en deux États souverains et adjacents, n'est toujours pas réalisé. Le peuple palestinien n'a toujours pas acquis sa liberté et ne peut pas vivre en paix sur le territoire de son État souverain et indépendant. Et la poursuite de la colonisation illégale du territoire palestinien occupé par Israël sape quotidiennement cette vision des deux États et compromet les perspectives de paix dans le cadre d'une solution juste et durable à la question de Palestine. Dans le territoire palestinien occupé, y compris à Jérusalem-Est, les Palestiniennes et les Palestiniens subissent quotidiennement des violations de leurs droits humains. La liberté de circulation y est fortement restreinte. La force est régulièrement employée de façon excessive contre la population civile, tandis que les enfants subissent des traumatismes et sont détenus illégalement pendant des mois dans les centres de détention israéliens. L'expansion des colonies se poursuit sans relâche et en toute impunité, au mépris du droit international et des résolutions pertinentes des organes de l'ONU, notamment la résolution 2334 de 2016 du Conseil de sécurité. Les saisies des biens et la démolition des maisons et de structures ont atteint un niveau sans égal. Selon le Bureau de la coordination des affaires humanitaires, 869 Palestiniennes et Palestiniens se sont retrouvés sans abri cette année à la suite des destructions de biens commises par Israël, le plus grand nombre réalisé depuis 2016. C'est le cas, par exemple, du village bédouin de Hamza el-Bakouay, en Cisjordanie, où au moins 73 habitants et habitantes, dont 41 enfants, ont été déplacés et plus de 75 structures ont été détruites, laissant les familles dépossédées et leurs moyens de subsistance anéantis. Des milliers de familles palestiniennes vivent sous la menace de l'expulsion ou de la démolition de leur domicile et du transfert forcé. De plus, des communautés entières affrontent la menace quotidienne posée par des colons israéliens extrémistes qui les intimident et les attaquent en toute impunité. Il faut déclarer clairement que les colonies sont illégales au regard du droit international et qu'il est impératif d'arrêter totalement leur construction et leur planification, y compris, entre autres projets, les plans récemment annoncés concernant Gavat Hamatos, qui, s'ils étaient construits, rompraient la contiguïté territoriale entre Jérusalem-Est et Bethléem, la principale zone métropolitaine palestinienne. Les colonies israéliennes représentent un grave obstacle à la paix et avec le mur de séparation construit illégalement dans les territoires occupés, elles sont le signe le plus visible de l'enracinement de l'occupation et de l'annexion de facto des terres palestiniennes. Et comme l'a récemment demandé l'écrasante majorité des membres du Conseil de sécurité, Israël doit cesser une fois pour toutes tous ces projets d'annexion de jure. Dans la bande de Gaza, les Palestiniennes et les Palestiniens vivent la 13e année d'un blocus israélien illégal qui continue à les isoler et à les appauvrir. Pendant cette pandémie de Covid-19, le blocus a continué à les priver d'un accès adéquat à l'aide humanitaire et socio-économique. Le comité appelle les parties à faire preuve de toute la retenue possible pour atténuer les tensions qui se sont récemment durcies entre Israël et des groupes palestiniens à Gaza, notamment le Hamas. Afin de garantir que les Palestiniennes et les Palestiniens, y compris les réfugiés de Palestine, puissent vivre dans la dignité, le comité invite les États membres à remédier d'urgence au déficit de financement de l'Office de secours et des travaux des Nations Unies pour les réfugiés de Palestine et dans le Proche-Orient, UNRWA, un déficit qui a atteint le montant stupéfiant de 115 millions de dollars en novembre, menaçant la continuité de programmes vitaux bénéficiant à 5,7 millions de réfugiés de Palestine, dont un demi-million d'écoliers sur le territoire palestinien occupé et dans la région. Le comité invite instamment la communauté internationale à agir rapidement et à fournir à l'Office les ressources prévisibles dont il a besoin pour répondre aux besoins des réfugiés et prévenir les risques graves pour la stabilité régionale. Mesdames et messieurs, le comité soutient fermement le peuple palestinien dans la poursuite de ses droits inaliénables et d'une vie dans la paix, dans la justice, dans l'égalité et dans la dignité. Notre objectif commun demeure celui de parvenir à une solution juste et durable, consistant en deux États vivant côte à côte dans la paix et la sécurité, dans les frontières d'avant 1967 et avec Jérusalem-Est comme capitale de l'État de Palestine. Pour atteindre cet objectif, le comité soutient l'appel lancé par le président de l'État de Palestine, Mahmoud Abbas, en faveur d'une conférence de paix internationale sous les auspices d'un quatuor élargi pour le Moyen-Orient qui permettrait aux acteurs régionaux de contribuer à faire avancer le processus de paix. Le comité souligne également l'importance du rôle que doivent jouer l'Assemblée générale et le Conseil de sécurité dans la promotion d'une solution pacifique et demande instamment que soient respectées les obligations y afférentes. Le comité se félicite des efforts renouvelés de réconciliation palestinienne et des projets d'élection, ainsi que de l'annonce récente par le gouvernement palestinien de son intention de reprendre la coopération avec Israël sur la base du respect de ses accords avec les Palestiniens. Les récents accords bilatéraux visant à normaliser les relations entre Israël et certains pays de la région ne peuvent pas passer outre le fait qu'il est indispensable de régler la question de Palestine pour parvenir à une paix et à une sécurité juste et durable au Moyen-Orient. Mesdames et messieurs, l'année 2020 nous a tous et toutes mis à l'épreuve. La pandémie actuelle nous a mis face à un ennemi invisible, nous obligeant à repenser nos valeurs, nos priorités et nos anciens dogmes politiques et économiques. Dans le même temps, il nous est rappelé une fois de plus que l'obstacle le plus formidable peut se transformer en une occasion d'agir avec audace. C'est pourquoi nous sommes ici aujourd'hui. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui pour rappeler à tous et à toutes que le changement est possible et que le peuple palestinien a besoin de davantage de solidarité, qu'il a besoin d'une action résolue et audacieuse, fondée sur les principes inscrits dans la Charte des Nations Unies, le droit international et les résolutions de l'ONU. Nous sommes à un moment où les droits des Palestiniennes et des Palestiniens et le consensus international méritent et nécessitent plus que jamais notre soutien total. La communauté internationale tout entière, y compris nos partenaires dans la région, doit contribuer à une solution juste et durable qui nous permettra de célébrer en cette journée internationale de solidarité la liberté que le peuple palestinien aura enfin acquise après une si longue attente, ainsi que la paix entre Israël et la Palestine. Je vous remercie. That's the end of my statement. I now have the honor of giving the floor to the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır. You have the floor, sir.
Excellencies, Mr. Secretary General, I would like to thank the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for organizing this event to mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people and for the opportunity to address this poignant event. Since the founding of the United Nations 75 years ago, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been on our agenda. Despite the significant efforts that may have been made, peace in the Middle East is unfortunately still far away. And it is the Palestinian civilians who suffer most from decades of occupation, use of excessive and disproportionate force, arbitrary arrests, demolitions, illegal settlement activities, and other injustice. Of the 5 million people in Palestine, almost half need humanitarian assistance, over 1 million of whom are children. Attempts to erode the status of Jerusalem, threats of annexation, and the inhuman block of Gaza have all been part of a recurring pattern which severely curtails the fundamental rights and freedoms of Palestinians. Generations have been born in a desperate situation. Generations have lived in a permanent state of emergency. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the insecurity and extremely complex humanitarian conditions that many vulnerable Palestinians, including women and girls, already experience on a daily basis. Distinguished delegates, the parameters for a resolution to the conflict are clear. In 1947, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, which formed the legal basis for the establishment of the State of Israel and a second state for the Palestinian people. However, in the 7 decades that followed, we have failed to establish a state for the Palestinian people. A two-state solution, recognized by Resolution 181, is the only premise for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace between Israelis and Palestinians to bring security and prosperity to all. The United Nations must continue to support Palestinians and Israelis to resolve the conflict on the basis of international law and bilateral agreements, and realizing the vision of two states living side by side in peace and security within recognized borders on the basis of a pre-1967 lines. These terms of reference cannot be changed. The rights of Palestinian people are not up for negotiations. Only constructive negotiations between the parties in good faith, with support from the international community, and adhering to long-standing United Nations resolutions and long-agreed parameters will bring about a just and durable solution. I therefore encourage, in the strongest terms, all parties to embrace peace, set aside differences, and put the interests of the people they serve first. Excellencies, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, plays a vital role to meet the needs of 5.6 million Palestinian refugees. Despite their crucial work, funding gaps continue. Last month, UNRWA issued an emergency call for humanitarian assistance amid a dire cash flow crisis that has left it unable to pay the salaries of its nearly 30,000 employees. UNRWA needs predictable and sustained funding to ensure stability and security for Palestinian refugees. We must do our utmost to support them until a just, fair, agreed, and realistic solution to the plight of Palestinian refugees is finally reached within the framework of a two-state solution. Excellencies, I would like to take this opportunity to express my condolences for the passing of Dr. Saeb Erekat, who succumbed to COVID-19. He was a true champion of the Palestinian cause and died before the realization of justice, freedom, and peace, a goal he dedicated his life to. Dr. Erekat's vision and this International Day of Solidarity reminds us of our collective unfinished task of achieving peace in the Middle East. The United Nations will not waver in its commitment to the Palestinian people. Today, let us reaffirm our commitment to uphold the rights of the Palestinian people and to building a future of peace, justice, security, and dignity for Palestinians and Israelis alike. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, for his Our committee thanks you for your stewardship of the Assembly in dealing with the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory and the Middle East as a whole. I now have the honor of giving the floor to His Excellency Mr. Kholisa Mabongo on behalf of the President of the Security Council. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, the Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine, Mr. Riyad Mansour, Excellencies. I would like to thank the committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for inviting us in our capacity as the President of the Security Council in December 2020 to address this special commemorative meeting in observance of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Mr. Chairman, over the past year, the Security Council has remained seized with the situation in the Middle East, including the question of Palestine. The Council has continued to receive monthly briefings from the Secretary General Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and also held an open video teleconference in place of the quarterly open debates due to the constraints brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Council also convened an additional meeting in February 2020, at which President Mahmoud Abbas addressed the Council. The Security Council has further continued to receive reports from the Secretary General in briefings with the Special Coordinator every quarter, as well as the Secretary General's report in June 2020 on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. Mr. Chairman, the situation in the Middle East remains a constant concern for the Security Council due to the lack of progress in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Security Council remains fully committed to pursuing a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East in accordance with international law and all relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Council members remain concerned about the situation on the ground and continue to call for an immediate end to actions which undermine trust between the parties. Members of the Security Council have further condemned all acts of violence and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and all acts of terrorism. Members have also called for direct negotiations between the parties. The Security Council remains concerned about the humanitarian situation in the region, including in Gaza. Specific concern has been expressed at the impact of COVID-19, which has severely affected the economic and humanitarian situation in the region. Mr. Chairman, the Security Council will continue to follow closely the situation in the Middle East, including the question of Palestine, and pursue all efforts towards an environment conducive to achieving the peace and security that both the Israeli and Palestinian people need and deserve. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kholisa Mabongo.
Put mine. I'm not listening.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kholisa Mabongo, Deputy Representative of South Africa, who was speaking on behalf of the President of the Security Council, for his important statement, which reconfirms that the Council remains fully committed to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East, based on the vision of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, as well as also reflecting South Africa's long-standing and unwavering support for the realization of the rights, inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you very much. I am now pleased and honored to give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, allow me to reiterate my heartfelt condolences on the passing of our dear friend, Dr. Saeb Erekat. Today is very much about recommitting to the peaceful vision that he worked so hard to realize, and that I myself testified for more than 20 years. Regrettably, there is a long way to go. I address you today with a deep sense of worry about the grim realities in the occupied Palestinian territory and the diminishing prospects of resolving the conflict which has been with the United Nations since its very creation. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the already dire humanitarian and socio-economic situation. Israel's suspension of plans to annex parts of the West Bank has removed, for the time being, a critical threat to peace and regional stability. However, on the ground, the expansion of settlement planning and construction continues, while demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures by Israeli authorities across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, reached the highest documented rate in 4 years. Such actions are contrary to international law and undermine the prospects for the establishment of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Acts of violence, the constant threat of escalation in Gaza, movement and access restrictions, incitement, and human rights violations persist, keeping the situation highly volatile. In Gaza, militants continued to fire indiscriminate rockets and mortars towards Israeli civilian population areas in violation of international humanitarian law, which heightens the risk of a new round of hostilities. Gaza entered the 13th year of Hamas control. On the other hand, tight closures have exacerbated the suffering of the people. The lifting of the closures in line with Security Council Resolution 1860 and the reunification of Gaza and the occupied West Bank under a single democratic national government are essential for addressing the needs of the population and restoring faith in a political horizon. I hope that recent developments will encourage Palestinian and Israeli leaders to re-engage in meaningful negotiations with the support of the international community towards a two-state solution and will create opportunities for regional cooperation. Only a two-state solution that realizes the legitimate national aspirations of Palestinians and Israelis can lead to sustainable peace. The United Nations remains committed to supporting Palestinians and Israelis to resolve the conflict. The position of the United Nations is defined by resolutions of the Security Council and General Assembly, as well as international law and bilateral agreements. The framework capable of realizing the legitimate aspirations of those peoples is one of two states, living side by side in peace and security, based on the 1967 borders and with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. At the same time, we must support the life-saving work of UNRWA. I call on member states to provide the necessary resources for UNRWA to continue delivering its vital services to millions of Palestinian refugees. Failure to do so could pose serious risks to stability that the region cannot afford. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on this International Day of Solidarity, let us renew our commitments to the Palestinian people in their quest to achieve their inalienable rights and build a future of peace, justice, security, and dignity. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Secretary General for his important statement. I would also like to express the committee's sincere appreciation for his unwavering commitment and for his personal efforts aimed at advancing the two-state solution and in promoting also a comprehensive, just and lasting solution of the question of Palestine. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Riyad Mansour, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, who will read out a message from His Excellency Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, President of the State of Palestine. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I have the honor and the privilege to read the statement of His Excellency Mahmoud Abbas, the President of the State of Palestine, on this occasion of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. معالي السيد أنطونيو غوتيريس الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، معالي السيد فولكان بوزكير رئيس الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، سعادة السفير جيري ماثيو ماكيلا رئيس مجلس الأمن، سعادة السيد شيخ نيانغ رئيس اللجنة المعنية بممارسة الشعب الفلسطيني لحقوقه غير القابلة للتصرف، أصحاب السعادة السيدات والسادة، منذ تأسيسها قبل 75 عاما، قدمت الأمم المتحدة وعدا لشعوب ودول العالم للحفاظ على السلام والأمن الدوليين من خلال إعمال القانون الدولي، وعدا يوفر الكرامة والعدل والمساواة للإنسان ويدعم تحرير الشعوب وانعتاقها من الاستعمار والاحتلال، وعدا لتحقيق التنمية والازدهار في شعوب الأرض دون استثناء. ومن المفارقة أنه في الوقت الذي كانت هذه المنظمة تضع ميثاقها والمجتمع الدولي يعتمد الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان واتفاقيات جنيف، كان الشعب الفلسطيني يسلب من كافة حقوقه التي نصت عليها هذه المواثيق، ولا زال حتى يومنا هذا يرزح تحت الاحتلال. ولكن ذلك لم يفقدنا الإيمان بالشرعية الدولية والقانون الدولي كأساس للحل العادل، وقبلنا المفاوضات والعمل السياسي والمقاومة الشعبية السلمية طريقا للتوصل إلى نهاية الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لأرض دولة فلسطين ونيل شعبنا حريته واستقلاله. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة والأصدقاء الأعزاء، في ظل أحلك الظروف وأشدها، وبالرغم من النكبة والظلم وكل الممارسات الإسرائيلية التي يمكن أن تدفعنا للتخلي عن الإيمان بالحوار السلمي والنهج السياسي والقانوني، بقينا متمسكين بحقوقنا وملتزمين بالقانون الدولي ومطالبين باحترامه وتطبيقه في فلسطين، مدركين أن القانون الدولي مهما طال الزمن أو قصر هو حجر الأساس للمنظومة الدولية الذي يجب التمسك والالتزام به. وهنا نتوجه بالامتنان لكل دول العالم الملتزمة بالإجماع الدولي المبني على أساس حل الدولتين على حدود 1967 واحترام الوضع القانوني لمدينة القدس والوضع التاريخي القائم للأماكن المقدسة المسيحية والإسلامية بما في ذلك الحرم الشريف، ولكل من يؤمن ويقر بعدالة قضيتنا ومركزيتها رغم تكاثر الأزمات والصراعات العالمية، ولكل من يقدم الدعم السياسي لنا انسجاما مع ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، ولكل من يقدم المساندة الإنسانية والإنمائية لشعبنا ومؤسساته، وللأونروا حتى يتم التوصل إلى حل عادل لقضية اللاجئين الفلسطينيين وفقا لقرار الجمعية العامة 194. إننا نعرب عن جزيل شكرنا للدول التي رغم الضغوطات أكدت على التزامها بالقانون الدولي والشرعية الدولية وعدم الاعتراف بالوضع غير القانوني الذي تخلقه سياسات وإجراءات دولة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي من نشاطات استيطانية وإجراءات قمعية وخنق للاقتصاد الفلسطيني في أرض دولة فلسطين المحتلة بما فيها القدس الشرقية. كما ونقدم الشكر للدول التي ميزت في تعاملاتها بين إقليم السلطة القائمة بالاحتلال إسرائيل والأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة فلسطين، وإلى ضمان المساءلة بما يشمل عدم التعامل أو الاستثمار في المستوطنات أو مع مؤسساتها أو منتجاتها. وإننا نقول أنه قد آن الأوان للمجتمع الدولي لأن يتخذ تدابير عملية لترجمتها على أرض الواقع بوجود الإجماع الدولي ورفض سياسات الضم الاستعمارية والقهر والحصار التي زادت حدتها وتيرتها في ظل الجائحة بدلا من أن تتوقف، ولتمكين الشعب الفلسطيني من ممارسة حقه في تقرير مصيره ونيل حريته واستقلاله على أرض دولته المحتلة منذ العام 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. وهنا أجدد التذكير بأننا لا زلنا نمد أيدينا إلى السلام العادل المبني على قرارات الشرعية الدولية وحل الدولتين على حدود 1967، ونؤكد مجددا أننا على استعداد للذهاب إلى مفاوضات مباشرة مع إسرائيل، فنحن لم نرفض الذهاب إلى المفاوضات يوما، وقدمنا مبادرتنا للسلام في فبراير 2018 أمام مجلس الأمن، والتي طالبنا فيها بعقد مؤتمر دولي وتشكيل آلية دولية متعددة الأطراف كالرباعية الدولية لتساعد الجانبين في المفاوضات لحل جميع قضايا الوضع الدائم وتوفير الضمانات لتنفيذ ما يتم عليه ضمن فترة زمنية محددة لتحقيق سلام عادل وشامل وفقا لمرجعيات الشرعية الدولية. وفي هذه المناسبة إنني أجدد دعوتي للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة بالبدء وبالتعاون مع الرباعية الدولية ومجلس الأمن في ترتيبات عقد مؤتمر دولي كامل الصلاحيات وبمشاركة الأطراف المعنية كافة ابتداء من مطلع العام القادم بهدف الانخراط في عملية سلام حقيقية على أساس القانون الدولي والشرعية الدولية ومرجعيات عملية السلام، وبما يؤدي إلى إنهاء الاحتلال ونيل الشعب الفلسطيني حريته واستقلاله في دولته بعاصمتها القدس الشرقية على حدود العام 1967 وحل قضايا الوضع النهائي كافة. كما وأنتهز هذه الفرصة بتحية جميع الدول التي أعلنت دعمها للمؤتمر الدولي بما في ذلك شبه الإجماع الذي عبر عنه أعضاء مجلس الأمن خلال الاجتماع الذي عقد تحت الرئاسة الروسية في شهر أكتوبر. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الأصدقاء الأعزاء، الشعب الفلسطيني باق على أرضه ولن يقبل بالقهر والظلم، وسيواصل شعبنا صموده الأسطوري وكفاحه المشروع ضد الاحتلال الاستعماري لأرضنا وشعبنا. إننا لن نتخلى عن وحدة أرضنا وشعبنا، وسنواصل بناء مؤسساتنا الوطنية ونحافظ على سيادة القانون ونشر ثقافة السلام والتسامح الراسخة فينا. وفي يوم التضامن العالمي مع الشعب الفلسطيني نتقدم بالشكر والتقدير لكل الدول والحكومات والمنظمات والشعوب التي عبرت عن تضامنها مع الشعب الفلسطيني وأيدت نضاله الشرعي ودعت لصموده في أحلك الأوقات وهو يواجه أعتى التحديات. تستمد حركة التضامن العالمية قوتها من عدالة قضيتنا وثبات شعبنا ومن تجربة حركات التحرر ضد الاستعمار والأبرتايد والاضطهاد عبر التاريخ ونجاحها في تحقيق استقلالها وصولا لانضمامهم للأمم المتحدة كدول حرة ومستقلة. ونستمد نحن من هذا التضامن العالمي مزيدا من العزيمة والقناعة أننا في يوم قريب سنحصل على مكاننا الطبيعي الشرعي بين الأمم، شعب حر ومستقل ومزدهر يساهم في تحقيق عالم أكثر عدلا ونموا وسلاما. وأشكركم سيدي الرئيس. Allow me also, Mr. Chairman, to thank the Secretary General and all of you for expressing condolences on the passing away of Saeb Erekat. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Excellency. I would like to ask you to convey with our greetings our sincere thanks to His Excellency Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, President of the State of Palestine, for his very significant message. I would also like you to assure President Abbas that through him and to the Palestinian people of our committee's firm vow to continue its efforts as mandated by the General Assembly with a view to promoting a comprehensive, just and lasting settlement of the question of Palestine and realization of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including the right to self-determination as an independent state of Palestine. We are now concluding the first part of our meeting. I would like to thank His Excellency, the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency, the President of the Security Council, and His Excellency, the Secretary General, for their contribution to this significant occasion and for the expression of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move to the second part of the meeting, and I would like to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Riyad Mansour again, Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations, to introduce the launching of the exhibit entitled "The Writing is on the Wall, Annexation Past and Present," prepared in collaboration between the committee and the Mission of Palestine. Minister Mansour, you have the floor. Unmute, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor again. And I want to begin by expressing our gratitude to the committee, to the division, and to my team in putting together this very unique exhibit of artistic work. Some of it is done on the wall, along with some footage of cultural musical performances of Palestinian artists. It has been the tradition for our committee on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People to have an exhibit at the entrance of the visitor section of the United Nations, in which thousands of people who come to the UN can see such contribution by the Palestinian people or telling part of their narratives to the thousands of people who come to visit the United Nations. However, this year, because of the COVID, it was not possible to do it that way. And the creativity of the entire team who were responsible for putting this exhibit together, the writing is on the wall, Annexation Past and Present, put it virtually. And I sincerely hope that all who are watching us today and those who will be able to virtually watch this exhibit for at least the coming month to enjoy it and to see the resiliency of the Palestinian people, even in the darkest moment, to show their creativity, their brilliance, their resiliency, and their contribution in so many fields, including the art. I hope that you can enjoy this, all of your friends to access it, watch it, to share it. This is part of the struggle of the Palestinian people. This is part of our story. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that you all enjoy this exhibit.
Statements reaffirming support for the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders and opposing Israeli annexation have poured in from almost all countries, from the Middle East Quartet, as well as from representatives of the US Congress. As welcome as they are, statements are not enough, and the time for action is long overdue. The expansion of Israel's control over the Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, is eroding literally the possibility of achieving the two-state solution.
Israel's threat to annex parts of the occupied West Bank has alarmed Palestinians, many Israelis, and the broader international community. If implemented, annexation would constitute the most serious violation of international law, grievously harm the prospect of a two-state solution, and undercut the possibilities of a renewal of negotiations. I call on the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans.
You will all agree with me that despite being shared through our visual platform, this exhibit we have just listened to and watched is simply both very meaningful and very beautiful. I would like now to introduce the international organizations that have supported the Palestinian cause and over the years who have chose to participate in this special meeting to express their solidarity. We will listen next to the representatives of the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories, the African Union, the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the Non-Aligned Movement. And they will be followed by the representative of the civil society. I would like to now to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Syed Mohammed Hasrin Aidid, Permanent Representative of Malaysia, United Nations, to speak on behalf of the Chair of the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to address this special meeting on behalf of the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories. Allow me to also extend the heartfelt and deepest condolences of the Special Committee on the passing of the late Dr. Said Erekat. This year marks the 73rd year since the passage of General Assembly Resolution 181 Roman II of 1947 and the 43rd year since the General Assembly established the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. They remain painful reminders of the unfinished task of resolving the question of Palestine. We join others in standing together on this day, united and bound by a common purpose to seek ways for a peaceful, just and equitable solution to the plight of the Palestinian people. Mr. Chairman, the Special Committee presented its 52nd report pursuant to the General Assembly Resolution 74/87 last month, and the report will be presented to the General Assembly for adoption tomorrow. The committee had online briefings and consultations with member states, UN agencies, and civil society, who provided vivid testimonies and accounts of the daily cycle of violence and hardship that the Palestinian people face, where every aspect of life continues to be impacted by the unlawful occupation. The committee also focused a portion of its report on the gendered impact of Israeli practices and policies on the human rights of Palestinian people, of Palestinian women and girls, and the impact of COVID-19 on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Special Committee also made 18 and 8 recommendations to the Israeli government and international community, respectively, to ensure that the welfare and human rights of the Palestinian people are safeguarded. Mr. Chairman, the committee remains concerned on a number of human rights issues related to the ongoing expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, the increase in settler violence, the grave humanitarian crisis in Gaza, the continued use of arbitrary and administrative detention, and the precarious situation of Palestine refugees and the human rights situation in the occupied Syrian Golan, and the lack of accountability for violations amidst the threat of annexation plan by the Israeli government. The committee is dismayed that de facto annexation of Palestinian territory continues to take place with rising settlement expansion, home confiscations and demolitions, and acts of violence and human rights violations against the Palestinian people. The committee remains alarmed that Israel's annexation plan have not been abandoned. We join the international community in continuing to underscore that any annexation would constitute a grave breach of international law, the UN Charter, and relevant Security Council resolution. We remain concerned on the recent demolition and seizures in the occupied West Bank early this month, including in Area C and East Jerusalem. The committee calls on Israeli authorities to cease demolitions, seizures of Palestinian property, and forcible relocation of communities that are contrary to international law and jeopardize the establishment of a viable contiguous Palestinian state. We remain concerned that despite the pandemic, instances of excessive use of force, home demolitions, settler violence, and night raids have continued to be reported, and in some cases, even at a higher level than periods before the pandemic. The committee recalls that Israel, as the occupying power, is responsible for ensuring the right to health for Palestinians and urges Israel to take necessary measures to ensure that Palestinians are protected from the outbreak and have access to required medical services. Mr. Chairman, the blockade of Gaza enters its 14th year and the situation remains dire. More than 90% of the water is undrinkable due to water contamination. Almost half of the population is unemployed and living below the poverty line, with 80% relying on humanitarian assistance. The committee calls upon the government of Israel to end the blockade and occupation of the occupied Palestinian Territory and the occupied Syrian Golan in compliance with Security Council resolutions 242, 497, and 2334. Mr. Chairman, the Special Committee joins the consistent call by the international community for a just and lasting resolution of the question of Palestine based on the two-state solution of 1967 borders and an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people. The overwhelming solidarity with the Palestinian people demonstrates that the international community supports a negotiated settlement for a just and peaceful solution. On this International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, let their resilience and strength of purpose inspire us to reinvigorate our collective efforts and commitment to forge a lasting settlement on the question of Palestine. To this end, we reaffirm our steadfast support of their cause and uphold the rights of the Palestinian people in striving to gain their legitimate rights and aspirations towards building a future of peace, justice, security, and dignity. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Saeed Mohammed Hasrin Aidid for his important statement. We are appreciative of your committee's dedication to its mission, particularly in promoting and defending the cause of the Palestinian people. We also appreciate your continued contribution to our meeting, as well as for your country's participation in our committee's activities as an active member. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Her Excellency Mrs. Fatima Kiari Mohammed, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations, who will read a message from His Excellency Mr. Musa Faki Mohammed, Chair of the African Union Commission. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, permit me to stand on existing protocols. I'd like to thank the committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for organizing today's meeting to mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This once again provides an opportunity to raise awareness amongst the international community on the unresolved question of Palestine and reiterate our support and solidarity with the Palestinian people. I congratulate my brother, Ambassador Sheikh Niang, the permanent representative of Senegal, for his leadership, and also commend the committee for its tireless efforts in supporting the question of Palestine, which unfortunately remains unresolved while the Palestinian people continue to face ever-increasing challenges while their territory remains occupied. The virtual exhibition and the accompanying music we just saw was very moving and reminds us of the reality that behind all our actions, there are human beings that bear the consequences. Mr. Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today I have the honor to convey to the meeting the message of solidarity and support of His Excellency Musa Faki Mohammed, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission. And I quote, "To the people of Palestine, I send you on my behalf and on behalf of all African people our warm greetings and sincere thoughts on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. The African Union Commission continues to call on the international community to assume its responsibilities concerning the question of Palestine and the implementation of all UN resolutions adopted from 1948 to date to compel Israel to comply with international law. For the last 6 decades, Israel continues its policy of building settlements in the Palestinian occupied territory in clear violation of international norms and standards. These illegal settlements are built on confiscated or stolen Palestinian land. Therefore, these illegal settlements contribute to forced displacement, severely limiting Palestinian access to basic resources, including land, water, food, and housing. They perpetuate a system of segregation and structural inequality between Palestinians and Israelis, exactly as the apartheid system was in Africa. In addition, the issue of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails and detention centers remains a sensitive issue for the Palestinian people and its leadership. The prisoners suffer from difficult and inhumane detention conditions in violation of all basic human rights law and international humanitarian law. The number of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli detention centers have increased, and many of the detainees are jailed without charges or trials under the so-called administrative arrest. The Palestinian Authority, led by President Mahmoud Abbas, has always emphasized that it will continue to explore political and diplomatic efforts at all levels in order to maintain the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. We strongly support this peaceful way to fight for Palestinian rights. Therefore, the international community, the Quartet, the UN Security Council, and all regional and international organizations are called upon to request Israel to implement decisions and declarations taken thus far to promote peace and stability based on the two-state solution. The city of East Jerusalem and its holy sites have never been in danger as they are now, and Christians and Muslims are fundamentally deprived from practicing their faith. The rejection by Israel of appeals by the international community to stop the confiscation of land and the demolition of homes and places of worship for both Palestinian Christians and Muslims is a matter of deep concern. The government of Israel also continues its efforts to force Palestinian families from their homes by imposing high taxes and other forms of discriminatory policies. Today, more than ever, there's a need for urgent and renewed efforts to find a just and lasting solution to the conflict based on the existence of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and harmony within the framework of the relevant African Union and United Nations pronouncements. The current situation calls for urgent action towards ending the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. The African Union's support to the Palestinian cause is premised on the values of freedom, justice, and humanitarian principles that Africa defends in the international fora, alongside all those striving to ensure that Palestine gains its right to exist as a key state in the Middle East. The African Union Commission has consistently expressed deep concerns at the consequences of unilateral policies, actions, and provocations, including the ongoing lockdown on the Gaza Strip. The African Union Commission reiterates its commitment to support all efforts aimed at achieving a final solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict based on international legitimacy, and rejects any incomplete and fragmental solutions such as temporary borders or the Jewishness of Israel. The African Union Commission will work tirelessly with other international actors to ensure the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the borders of June 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. Let's keep praying for peace, for freedom, and justice. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Mrs. Fatima Kiari Mohammed for this strong statement. I would like to ask my sister to please convey to the chair of the AU Commission our gratitude for the steadfast and principled support of the AU to the cause of the Palestinian people. I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdelaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations, to read out a message from His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Abul Gate, Secretary General of the League of Arab States. You have the floor, Excellency.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. السيد الرئيس يشرفني أن أتلو عليكم كلمة صاحب السعادة السيد أحمد أبو الغيط، أمين عام جامعة الدول العربية، في اليوم العالمي للتضامن مع الشعب. وأقترح السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، يأتي اليوم العالمي للتضامن مع الشعب الفلسطيني الذي أقرته الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة في قرارها سنة 1977 هذا العام، في ظل ظروف استثنائية يعيش العالم بأسره جراء جائحة كورونا التي فرضت تحديا جديدا إضافيا على الأسرة الدولية يتطلب تضافر كافة الجهود من أجل التصدي لها وحماية البشر في مختلف أنحاء العالم من تبعاتها الصحية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية الكارثية. ورغم الانشغال العالمي بهذا الخطر المستجد، إلا أن أحد أبرز الشواغل العربية والإقليمية والدولية هو استمرار التبعات الكارثية لاستمرار الاحتلال الإسرائيلي وحرمان الشعب الفلسطيني من حقوقه المشروعة غير القابلة للتصرف التي أقرتها المواثيق والقرارات الدولية، لتتضاعف معاناة الشعب الفلسطيني هذا العام الذي يبقى أسيرا بين مطرقة الاحتلال بوحشيته وانتهاكاته وممارساته العنصرية والتهويد والاستيطان وهدم البيوت والتشريد والحصار والضم وابتلاع الأراضي وسندان الجائحة الصحية العالمية التي تنتشر وتتفاقم في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، في ظل إصرار سلطات الاحتلال على حرمان الفلسطينيين من أبسط حقوقهم الإنسانية في الرعاية الصحية اللازمة والحصول على الأجهزة الطبية المطلوبة. وتحرص جامعة الدول العربية على إحياء اليوم العالمي للتضامن مع الشعب الفلسطيني سنويا، تأكيدا على مركزية القضية الفلسطينية بالنسبة للأمة العربية، وعلى توجيه رسالة تضامن تعطي الفلسطينيين أملا بأن الظلم الذي وقع عليهم منذ أكثر من 70 عاما، أي منذ عام 1947 حينما صدر قرار التقسيم في 29 نوفمبر وما نتج عنه من نكبة الشعب الفلسطيني، لن يدوم، وأن فجر الحرية آت، وهذه مسؤولية تقع على المجتمع الدولي بإلزام إسرائيل القوة القائمة بالاحتلال بالانصياع للقوانين والقرارات الدولية وإنهاء احتلالها وإقامة الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية على حدود عام 1967. لقد أثبتت التجارب وبما لا يدع مجالا للشك أن أي محاولات للانقضاض على حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني تجاهل مبادئ القانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية مآلها الفشل، وأن أي توجه نحو فرض أمر واقع أو طرح مبادرات وخطط لا تتماشى مع هذه المبادئ والأسس والمرجعيات الدولية لعملية السلام القائمة على مبدأ الأرض مقابل السلام ووفق رؤية حل الدولتين ستنتهي وتصبح من الماضي، وسيبقى الحق الفلسطيني ثابتا لا يسقط بالتقادم أو بأي وسيلة أخرى. سيداتي والسادة، علينا جميعا أن نتحمل مسؤولياتنا تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني وقضيته العاجلة، وأن نبادر إلى وضع سلطات الاحتلال أمام مسؤولياتها في الاستجابة لمتطلبات تحقيق السلام العادل الذي يضع حدا لهذا الاحتلال الطويل، ولتمكين الشعب الفلسطيني من ممارسة حقوقه غير القابلة للتصرف، وفي مقدمتها حقه في العودة والاستقلال. علينا المبادرة واتخاذ المزيد من التدابير الكفيلة بوقف ممارسات الاحتلال وانتهاكاته الجسيمة للقانون الدولي وقرارات الشرعية الدولية، والعمل من أجل إنفاذ القرارات والمواثيق الدولية في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، وفي مقدمتها اتفاقيات جنيف. وعلينا أيضا توفير الحماية الدولية للشعب الفلسطيني، والاستمرار في تقديم كافة أشكال الدعم والمساندة المالية والسياسية والقانونية للشعب الفلسطيني وقيادته، فضلا عن الاستمرار في دعم المؤسسات الدولية العاملة في مجال الإغاثة، وفي مقدمتها وكالة الأونروا التي تقدم خدماتها الإنسانية في الرعاية الصحية والإغاثة والتعليم لأكثر من 5.5 مليون لاجئ فلسطيني. ويبقى هدفنا جميعا هو تحقيق السلام العادل والدائم والشامل في المنطقة عبر الحل السياسي، من خلال استئناف مفاوضات جادة ذات مصداقية وبإطار زمني محدد بإشراف دولي متعدد الأطراف وتحت مظلة الأمم المتحدة، واستنادا إلى القوانين والقرارات الدولية ذات الصلة ومبادرة السلام العربي. ولعل دعوة الرئيس محمود عباس رئيس دولة فلسطين لعقد مؤتمر دولي للسلام مع بداية عام 2021 والتجاوب الدولي الكبير معها يمثل فرصة ينبغي اغتنامها من أجل أمن واستقرار المنطقة. ختاما سيد الرئيس، وفي اليوم العالمي للتضامن مع الشعب الفلسطيني، نوجه تحية إعزاز وإجلال وإكبار إلى الشعب الفلسطيني المناضل الذي يضرب أروع الأمثلة في الصمود وفي قوة الإرادة الحرة والإصرار على استعادة حقوقه المشروعة في دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. ونوجه تحية إلى أرواح من استشهدوا في هذا النضال على مر السنين، وآخرهم السيد صائب عريقات الذي أفنى حياته من أجل دفع المفاوضات الهادفة لاستعادة هذه الحقوق. كما نوجه تحية تقدير إلى كل الدول والشعوب التي وقفت إلى جانب النضال العادل للشعب الفلسطيني في وجه ممارسات الاحتلال الاستيطانية التوسعية، وخاصة وقفة العالم المشرفة من مخططات الضم الإسرائيلي. ونوجه التحية إلى كل المتضامنين مع الشعب الفلسطيني وعدالة قضيته في كافة أنحاء العالم على شجاعتهم وانتصارهم للحق الفلسطيني ونبل ما يقومون به من عمل إعلاء للقيم النبيلة في الحرية والعدالة. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Majid Abdulaziz for the important and very meaningful message he read on behalf of the League of Arab States. Excellency, your organization is an active partner of our committee, and we appreciate its precious contribution to the global efforts aiming at the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Akshin Mehdiyev, Permanent Observer of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, reading out a message from His Excellency Dr. Yusuf bin Ahmad Al-Uzaymin, Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to deliver a statement of His Excellency Dr. Yusuf Al-Utaymin, Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Your Excellency Ambassador Sheikh Nia, Chairman of the United Nations Committee of the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, Excellencies, This international gathering, held on 29th November of every year to celebrate the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, in consistence with the UNGA's relevant resolutions, takes on a particular importance as an opportune occasion to reiterate our political stance, aspirations, responsibilities towards the Palestine issue, as well as our unwavering commitment to supporting the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Please allow me on this occasion to express on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation our thanks and appreciation to the United Nations and its various organs and bodies, namely the United Nations Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, under the chairmanship of Ambassador Sheikh Niang and its respected members, for their active efforts to promote the Palestinian cause and strengthen the international support for and solidarity with the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is taking place against the backdrop of difficult circumstances and extremely distressing challenges in the occupied Palestinian territory, where the Palestinian lands are still subject to the Israeli occupation, colonial settlement, blockade, and plagued with the restless separation war. Indeed, Israeli fanatic settlers continue abusive and intimidating acts and violence, resulting in Palestinian casualties, property damage, as well as annexation of Palestinian land and constructing more than 12,000 new colonial settlement units during 2020. Such a policy seriously threatens to undermine the territorial integrity and contiguity of a future state of Palestine and jeopardize the viability of the two-state solution, in addition to being a flagrant violation of international law and relevant UN resolutions. The OIC affirms in this regard that necessary measures should be taken by the international community to put an end to the Israeli settlement policy and ensure Israel's respect for and compliance with its resolutions, in particular UN Security Council Resolution 2334. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot review the current developments without reference to the gravity of the situation in the occupied city of Jerusalem, namely the Israeli Judaization policy aimed at altering the Arab Islamic Christian character, status, and demographic composition. We reaffirm that the city of Jerusalem is an integral part of the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, and all illegal measures and decisions aimed at altering its historical, legal, and political status are null and void according to international law and UN resolutions, and remain rejected and unrecognized by the international community. The OIC invites all UN member states to abide by their political and legal obligations, ensure respect for international law, and contribute to the international efforts to end the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory and realize the vision of the two-state solution on the 1967 borders, to which the OIC remains fully committed. Ladies and gentlemen, the plight of the Palestinian prisoners in the Israeli prisons continue to be a case of denial of justice and the heinous crime and odious practices perpetrated by the Israeli occupation against Palestinian citizens. We urge in this regard the international community to act effectively to defend their basic human rights and compel Israel, the occupying power, to respect the provisions and principles of international humanitarian law and halt all its violations, which threaten to further deteriorate the situation at all levels and inflict more suffering on the Palestinian people. Ladies and gentlemen, the OIC also emphasized the need to remain committed to the political, legal, and humanitarian mandate of UNRWA to support its mission in discharging basic services to Palestine refugees and to make sure that their concerns and growing needs are receiving adequate attention. We are confident that solidarity and joint international efforts to mobilize resources will contribute to reducing the difficulties that UNRWA encounters and help mitigate the suffering of Palestinian refugees until the achievement of a final settlement of their issue in line with the relevant UN Resolution 194. The OIC fully supports the call by the Palestinian President Mohammed Abbas on the UN Secretary General to take necessary steps in cooperation with all members of the UN Security Council and International Quartet towards convening a multilaterally sponsored international peace conference with full authority and with the participation of all concerned parties to engage in a meaningful peace process based on international law, UN resolutions, and the Arab Peace Initiative, with the objective of ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinian people to regain their legitimate right to freedom and independence within their sovereign state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and resolving all final status issues, including the question of the refugees based on UN resolutions 194. We hope that this meeting will succeed in mobilizing increased support from the international community to the just cause of Palestine and wishing for its success. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Akshin Mehdiyev for this very important and inspiring message. We would like to express the sincere appreciation of the committee for the OIC's strong and unwavering support of our committee's activities. Thank you, sir. I would also like to advise our panelists to unlock their cameras so that they can be seen very easily by all. So let me now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Yashar Aliyev, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Azerbaijan to the United Nations, who will be reading out a message on behalf of the movement of non-aligned movement of non-aligned countries. Sorry. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the non-aligned movement. In this solemn observation of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, the non-aligned movement reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people and support for their inalienable human rights, including to self-determination and independence, and renews its abiding commitment in the efforts to achieve a fair and lasting solution to the Palestine question and genuine peace and security in the Middle East on the basis of international law and the relevant United Nations resolutions. The non-aligned movement renews its appreciation to the Committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and the Division for Palestinian Rights of the United Nations Secretariat for their important work and highly valued assistance in this regard, in line with their General Assembly mandates. Similarly, the movement once again commends the efforts of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, in providing essential humanitarian development and emergency assistance and protection to the 5.6 million Palestine refugees in all fields of operation, as well as expresses its sincere appreciation to all United Nations agencies with special programs providing needed support to the Palestinian people, including children and women. In light of the grave financial situation being faced by UNRWA at this time, the NAM reiterates its appeal to all states to provide predictable and sufficient financial support to ensure the continuity of its vital assistance programs at a time of increasing need and of its tangible contribution to regional stability. Mr. Chairman, this past June regrettably marked 53 years since the illegal Israeli military occupation of the Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and other Arab territories in 1967. This year also marks the 73rd anniversary of the General Assembly's adoption of the Resolution 181 Rome II, partitioning mandate Palestine, and May 2020 marked the 72nd anniversary of the 1948 Al-Nakba that tragically befell the Palestinian people. These solemn occasions prompt the non-aligned movement to reiterate its long-standing call for the exertion and intensification of all necessary efforts to bring an end to this injustice and advance a peaceful and just solution. The international community is called upon to act forthwith to uphold its responsibilities and obligations toward the Palestine question until it is justly resolved. Mr. Chairman, in October 2019, the Ministerial Committee of the Non-Aligned Movement on Palestine was convened in Baku to review the latest developments in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Regrettably, the situation there remains critical and unsustainable. The ministers underscored their deep regret that the Palestinian people continue to suffer under brutal Israeli military occupation, blockade, and oppression, and continue to be deprived of their fundamental human rights. All of their rights are being deliberately and systematically violated by the occupying power, which continues its settlement colonization of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and its oppression and collective punishment of the defenseless and innocent Palestinian children, women, and men, and continues to perpetrate grave human rights violations, many of which may account to war crimes. This is causing deep trauma and suffering among the Palestinian civilian population, especially in the Gaza Strip, where the humanitarian situation is dire and becoming untenable and unlivable. In its unanimously adopted political declaration, the Ministerial Committee inter alia renewed the movement's call for a cessation of all these violations of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law, and for compliance with international law and all relevant United Nations resolutions, and reaffirmed its abiding solidarity and unwavering support for inalienable rights and just cause of the Palestinian people. NAM stresses that a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution to the question of Palestine remains a permanent responsibility of the United Nations until it is justly and satisfactorily resolved in all its aspects. The movement emphasizes the need for urgent mobilization and exertion of multilateral efforts to advance the realization of a political horizon and solution, and until its achievement, for efforts to alleviate the humanitarian and socioeconomic hardships being endured by the people of Palestine. In this regard, NAM endorses the call by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for the timely convening of an international peace conference to advance the achievement of a just and lasting solution based on international law and the relevant resolutions. On this day, the movement must express its deep regret that, despite decades of their participation in peace efforts in good faith, despite their proven commitment to the two-state solution for peace, despite their adherence to international law, and despite the painful compromises made, the plight of the Palestinian people has worsened and a just solution remains elusive. As the Security Council remains paralyzed on this issue, in spite of its charter duties, the situation only continues to further deteriorate and destabilize. This must be cause for great concern among the international community and should prompt urgent action to hold Israel, the occupying power, accountable for its violations and to bring them to a halt, including all illegal settlement and annexation activities in all parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Only such action can salvage the prospect for peace, bring an end to the Israeli occupation, and realize the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions, the Madrid Principles, and the Arab Peace Initiative. All relevant Security Council resolutions and the obligations under the international law, including the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention, must be implemented. NAM also condemns the provocations and incitements by a group of extremist settlers, including against the holy sites in occupied East Jerusalem, including Al-Haram al-Sharif, and the vandalization of mosques and churches, which are fueling tensions and religious sensitivities that risk further destabilization, and calls for respect for the sanctity of holy sites and for full respect for the historic and legal status quo that has been in place for decades. Mr. Chairman, today Non-Aligned Movement also reiterates its demand for the full and immediate lifting of the illegal blockade of Gaza Strip by Israel, which continues to severely impair all aspects of life of the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza, imposing a dire humanitarian crisis on them, further exacerbated by the current COVID-19 pandemic and constituting a massive collective punishment. Moreover, the Non-Aligned Movement reiterates its grave concern about the lack of accountability for the countless violations being committed by Israel, including the killing and injury of innocent and defenseless Palestinian civilians, among them children and women. Such lack of accountability continues to fuel a culture of impunity and destabilize the situation on the ground, while diminishing the prospects for peace, and requires urgent action by the international community to address these grave violations and bring an end to this unjust situation. Mr. Chairman, the solidarity of the international community with the just Palestinian cause must be directed to all relevant efforts in support of the independence and sovereignty of the State of Palestine in all of the Palestinian territory occupied by Israel in 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, in accordance with the relevant resolutions, and to support of admission of Palestine to the United Nations as a full member state. To conclude, on this important day, the NAM reiterates its resolute adherence to a just, lasting, comprehensive, and peaceful solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is at the core of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Such a peaceful solution remains a long-standing objective of the movement. In this regard, the Non-Aligned Movement reaffirms today its unwavering commitment to the restoration of inalienable rights of the heroic Palestinian people to self-determination, including the right to their independent, democratic, and viable state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital, and a just solution for the plight of the Palestine refugees on the basis of the General Assembly Resolution 194, the pillars of a just and lasting peace. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Yashar Aliyev for the very important message of the Non-Aligned Movement. We thank NAM for its strong support to the settlement of the question of Palestine. We also thank your country, Azerbaijan, for its leadership in upholding that principled support. I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to Reverend Erica Williams, social justice activist with Blacks for Palestine. She is a native of Saginaw, Michigan, and has been a community organizer for over 15 years. She is a 2016 graduate of Howard University School of Divinity. Reverend Williams has worked with movements in the US, Brazil, and South Africa. She also serves as one of the lead organizers for the, quote, Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, end quote, and she has dedicated her life to liberating those that are marginalized and oppressed. Reverend, you have the floor, and thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Security General, Mr. President, Excellencies, and to each of you, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to the General Assembly's Committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, for inviting civil society to participate in today's solemn commemoration of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People. I will never forget Wednesday, July 28th, 2018. I was traveling on the public bus from Bethlehem to East Jerusalem, and we came to a checkpoint where all Palestinians had to exit off the bus to be searched before they could enter Israel. Even though the bus went from one Palestinian destination to another, from occupied Bethlehem to occupied East Jerusalem, there was a mother on the bus with 2 small children, and she was rushed off the bus by an Israeli officer who had a large gun around his chest and pointed it towards her. I could see the fear and terror in the woman's eyes. She was searched and allowed back on the bus, but she held her children tight for the remainder of the ride. I was allowed to stay on the bus because I had an American passport. This experience caused me to have nightmares for weeks. I come to you today in the spirit of the brown-skinned Palestinian Jew, Jesus Christ, who grew up in Nazareth, a town which was poor, marginalized, occupied, and militarized by the Roman Empire. When he started his public ministry, he came with a clear message concerning what he was sent to earth to do. His purpose can be found in the gospel passage of Luke 4:18, verses 19. God's spirit is on me. He has chosen me to preach the message of good news to the poor, sent me to announce pardon to prisoners and the recovery of sight to the blind, to set the burdened and battered free, to announce this is God's year to act. We are calling you to act and to do it now. And I want to be very clear that the fight for the liberation of the Palestinians is not only being waged by Christians, but people of all faith traditions, including Jews, Muslims, and more, and all people who hold the belief that all people are born free and deserve dignity. For 43 years, the UN General Assembly and most of its member states have commemorated the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Palestinians have indeed seen changes in their lives during that time, but those changes have made their lives worse and not better. The apartheid wall in the West Bank was built as the International Day of Solidarity was solemnly proclaimed each year. The International Court of Justice ruled that the wall violated international law and should be removed from Palestinian territory, and yet the wall remains. In 2008, 2012, and 2014, the Israeli military launched wars against the occupied and besieged Gaza Strip, while the International Day of Solidarity remained an annual event, and yet thousands of Palestinians, as well as 15 Israeli civilians, were killed in those wars. Commemorating international solidarity is not enough. It is not enough to cite the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when the obligation of the United Nations and its member states is to uphold and implement and defend those rights. Palestinians are still being denied their rights, and the UN must go beyond words to a new priority of action. And so therefore I come to you today with a heavy heart, not to give a great speech for people to clap and then go back to business as usual, but to remind you, as member states of the United Nations, you, excellencies, hold a grave responsibility. The protection of those languishing under military occupations lies in your hands. The restoration of human rights to those illegally denied such rights is your obligation. The defense of those unable to protect themselves is your burden. And I am sad to report to you today, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, that you all have written a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. I am from Saginaw, Michigan, which is next door to Flint, Michigan. Many of you have heard of the water crisis in Flint, where a brave Palestinian pediatrician refused to remain silent about the impact on children drinking poisoned water that resulted from a political decision. 6 years after Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha told the world about the Flint water crisis, I still have family members drinking bottled water because the problems from the poisoning of the water have not been solved. The water crisis proved once again that if you are a person of color or poor, your life does not matter to those in power. One of the things that really angered me during my time visiting refugee camps in Palestine was there was no green spaces for children. However, I saw children in Israeli settlements with sparkling swimming pools, parks and schoolyards filled with grass and flowers. Yet many Palestinian children in villages just below those hilltop settlements don't even have enough water to bathe or to drink. It reminded me of the fight that the Poor People's Campaign and so many others have been waging here in the United States against the issues of systemic racism, poverty, militarism, and ecological devastation. The United States government, with all of its power and wealth, continues to allow for more than 140 million people in the country to remain poor or low wealth. Yet Washington continues to spend its $3.8 billion of our tax money every year. They send it directly to the Israeli military. Since last year's solemn commemoration of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, the world has seen unprecedented transformations and faces new dangers. According to the World Health Organization, as of November 2020, a total of 91,464 cases of COVID-19 have been diagnosed in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, and 767 deaths have been reported. This is compounded by poor public health conditions, water and electricity crisis, rampant poverty, and a high population density. The Palestinian people were living in a pandemic of racism long before COVID-19 hit. On June 23rd, 2020, the Israeli military murdered Ahmed Erekat, a deeply loved 27-year-old brother and fiance. He was shot and killed as he was running errands for his sister on her wedding day. His mother and father simply want to say goodbye to their child and lay their son to rest, but the Israeli government is refusing to return him to his family unless they promise not to bring a legal case against the Israeli soldier who murdered their boy. Israel's practice to withhold the Palestinian dead is in grave violation of international humanitarian law stipulations with the Geneva Convention that upholds the respect for the dead and their burial. 5 days after George Floyd was murdered in the United States, Aid Halek, a 32-year-old severely autistic man, was shot and killed by Israeli border police. Ayed was walking along a path he took to his special school every day when the police yelled at him to stop. He did not understand what they were asking of him, and he continued to walk. The police chased him and began firing shots at him. Ayed was terrified and hid in the garbage room at the school. The police found him and shot him dead. This story is parallel to the stories of the United States of slave patrols, Jim Crow segregation, and mass incarceration. It is parallel to the stories of apartheid in South Africa. The fight against racism, income equality, and domination are global and interconnected. Malcolm X, speaking at a Methodist church in Rochester, New York in 1965, challenged any narrow view of rights. As long as you call it civil rights, you only have allies, can be people in the next community, many of whom are responsible for your grievance. But when you call it human rights, it becomes international. And then you can take your troubles before the world, and anybody anywhere on the earth can become your ally. Our movements today call as well for Palestinians to be free. Too many Palestinians have already died while you all wait to decide which side you will be on. We cannot wait. We will not wait. Palestinian lives matter. And we, the global society, civil society, are organizing and building power together around the world. The UN and almost all of its member states have for decades stated its opposition to Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Yet settlements continue to expand, including plans for 1,200 new illegal settlements, housing units announced in just the last few weeks. The UN and almost all of its member states have for decades rejected Israel's claim to sole control of Jerusalem as its capital. But Palestinians whose families in Jerusalem go back centuries continue to be denied the right to live in their own city. So, General Assembly and ambassadors from member states, I ask of you today, how much longer will the Palestinian people die from the knee of the Israeli government on their necks from racism, income inequality, and domination? How much longer will the Palestinian activists and human rights defenders like Itam Safin being arrested to silence the movement against the Israeli occupation? How much longer will the United States remain one of the biggest purveyors of violence against the Palestinians? How much longer? How much longer? That is the question I leave with you today. A universal truth reminds us that you reap what you sow. What will you sow on behalf of the Palestinian people? Thank you.
Reverend Williams, we thank you for your very powerful message, your truly inspiring message. We thank you for your time. We thank you for your passion. I think your eloquent call for commitment and action is loud and clear, and I have no doubt that your very powerful message, as I said, has been heeded, and I hope will be followed by action. So thank you once again so very much. Allow me to take this opportunity to thank also all civil society organizations active on the question of Palestine throughout the world for their valuable work in support of and solidarity with the Palestinian people. Thank you again, Reverend Williams. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's now my honor to announce that our committee has received messages of support and solidarity from many heads of state and government, from ministers of foreign affairs, from governments and organizations. I would like to read out the list of officials who sent them in the order in which they were received. We have received messages from the following heads of state: Afghanistan, Algeria, Brunei, China, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Jordan, Lao People's Democratic Republic, Lebanon, Morocco, Nicaragua, Qatar, Russia, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Tunisia, Turkey, Venezuela, Vietnam. We have received messages from the following heads of government: India, Malaysia, Malta, Thailand. The committee has also received messages from the following ministers of foreign affairs: Argentina, Bahrain, Ecuador, Japan, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Saudi Arabia, Syria. We have received messages from the following governments: Brazil, Costa Rica, Guyana, Namibia, South Africa. The committee has also received messages from the following organizations: African Union, European Union, League of Arab States, Non-Aligned Movement, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. All the messages of solidarity received will be posted on the website of the question of Palestine, maintained by the Division for Palestinian Rights, which is unispol.un.org. On behalf of the committee, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the heads of state and government, ministers for foreign affairs, governments, and to the organizations that I have just mentioned, and to all participants for their persistent efforts through 53 years of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory, aimed at achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the question of Palestine, and for the support they have always given to the mandated activities of this committee. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before adjourning this special meeting, I wish to thank everyone who has made this meeting possible, in particular the staff members of the Division for Palestinian Rights in the United Nations Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the Department for General Assembly and Conference Management, the Department of Global Communications, the Office of Central Support Services, interpreters, and everyone who worked behind the scenes. Tomorrow, December the 2nd, at 10 a.m., the General Assembly will begin its debate under the item Question of Palestine, during which and where His Excellency Mr. Neville Goetz, Permanent Representative of Namibia to the United Nations and Vice President of our committee, will introduce the draft resolutions related to this agenda item. And our rapporteur ad interim, Her Excellency Mrs. Adela Raz, Permanent Representative of Afghanistan to the United Nations, will introduce the annual report of the committee for 2020. We strongly encourage you to attend and support the adoption of the 4 resolutions on December the 2nd in the afternoon. We also call on member states to support with the traditional overwhelming majorities the important resolutions on the question of Palestine to be adopted in the General Assembly on the 2nd of December. I thank you all very much. The meeting is adjourned. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very much. Reverend, thank you very much once again. Abdulaziz, thank you. Bye-bye.